At a certain point, every piece of infrastructure ceases to be merely a tool. It begins to define the outer limits of security for the system in which it operates. That is precisely where Khark now stands. Its importance no longer arises only from the number of barrels passing through its terminals. It arises from something deeper. Without it, Iran's entire export mechanism stops functioning, and there is no simple way to replace that mechanism quickly. This is not a matter of convenience, nor is it merely a matter of optimization. It is a matter of structural dependence, built up over years. The concentration of infrastructure in one place created a solution of extraordinary efficiency, but it also created a system deprived of any real redundancy. Any serious disruption does not merely mean a decline in efficiency. It means its sudden collapse. In that sense, Khark is not simply important. It is critical. The distinction is fundamental. Important infrastructure can be replaced, at least partially, even if only with delay. Critical infrastructure offers no such option. Its loss leads to the immediate paralysis of the system. In Iran's case, that means the loss of export capacity on a scale that cannot be compensated for in the short term. That is why the island appears in so many analyses as a textbook example of a critical point, a place in which so many functions are concentrated that its removal sets off a domino effect, from logistics to finance to the political stability of the state. Khark is simultaneously Iran's greatest asset and its most obvious weakness. Concentrating exports in a single point increases operational efficiency, but it also raises systemic risk, especially in politically unstable regions, where infrastructure can become a target of military action, sabotage, or political coercion. In practical terms, the consequences of taking Khark offline are brutally simple, regardless of the cause. An attack, a naval blockade, a cyber attack, a technical failure. The effect is immediate, exports fall, and they cannot be redirected quickly. Other ports have limited capacity. They are not prepared to absorb operations on such a scale. That is what differentiates Iran from other states in the region. Saudi Arabia possesses alternative export routes, including pipelines leading to the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates has developed ports that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Iran remains, to a large extent, dependent on one direction and one point. That makes the system more centralized, but it also makes it less resilient. This dependence defines Khark's strategic position. The island does not merely handle exports, it also narrows the state's room for maneuver. In a crisis, there are very few options. One thing becomes decisive above all else: keeping it operational at any cost. That explains the level of protection surrounding it. It also explains its status as an absolute priority. Awareness of this dependence is not limited to Iran. It is widespread among analysts, military planners, and decision-makers. Khark appears in strategic scenarios as a potential target, as a pressure point, even if any move against it would carry an enormous risk of escalation. The island therefore functions in a state of permanent tension. It is both protected and threatened at the same time. Any potential adversary must take into account the consequences of shutting it down, and those consequences do not end with Iran. They extend across the entire global energy market. A disruption to Khark does not mean only trouble for one state. It means rising oil prices. It means supply disruption. It means a chain reaction on financial markets. The island becomes an element of the global system. Its stability matters to countries located thousands of kilometers away. Markets respond not only to actual disruptions, they respond to risk. The mere possibility of trouble is enough. Prices rise. Volatility increases. Expectations and fears begin to shape reality before events themselves fully materialize. That makes Khark function as a tension point, a place whose significance far exceeds its physical dimensions. It is there that expectations concentrate. It is there that fears accumulate. It is there that calculations related to energy security become intensely focused. And that is precisely why Khark is not merely an element of infrastructure, it is one of the points defining the limits of stability in the modern world. It shows how deeply the global economy depends on individual nodes, nodes whose loss can trigger consequences extending far beyond the region itself. There are places that operate locally, and there are places that set global processes in motion. Khark belongs to the second category. Its functioning does not stop at the borders of Iran or even at the borders of the Persian Gulf region. It extends through transport networks, financial systems, and industrial chains. It reaches refineries in Asia, it reaches fuel stations in Europe, it reaches factories on other continents. It creates a chain of dependence that begins on the island and ends in the daily lives of millions of people. Every barrel of oil leaving Khark is not merely raw material. It is an element of the global pricing system. Even small changes in supply can trigger reactions disproportionate to their scale. The energy market operates not only on the basis of actual deliveries, it also operates on expectations, fears, and forecasts. It takes only information about rising tension in the region or about a potential threat to Khark for markets to react immediately, often before any real disruption occurs. The mere possibility of export restrictions activates defensive mechanisms, speculative mechanisms, and at times outright panic. The result is always the same. Oil prices rise. That rise does not remain abstract. It does not stop at charts. It penetrates the real economy. It affects transport costs, production costs, energy costs. It pushes up the price of goods and services. And therefore, it feeds inflation felt directly by consumers in the form of more expensive fuel, more expensive food, and more expensive services. In that sense, Khark becomes part of everyday life, even though most people have never heard of it. Its functioning influences the prices we see every day, at fuel stations, in stores, in household energy bills. The island's influence does not stop with prices. It extends into financial systems as well. Changes in the oil market affect exchange rates, central bank decisions, and investment strategies. A single disruption can trigger a chain reaction encompassing the wider global economy. Oil importing states respond immediately. India, China, the countries of the European Union. They adjust purchasing policy. They increase strategic reserves. They search for alternative suppliers. That, in turn, changes global trade flows and shifts the balance of power. Oil exporting states look at the matter differently. Rising prices mean greater revenues, but they also mean greater political pressure and greater risk of destabilization. Khark, therefore, influences decisions taken in many countries far beyond the region. The island's influence is asymmetrical. A small disruption can produce very large effects. Increasing exports does not always work in the opposite direction with equal force. The system is more sensitive to supply loss than to supply growth. That further increases the importance of points such as Khark. Energy prices are among the key drivers of the global economy. They influence inflation. They influence growth. Every disruption in supply has the potential to trigger effects extending far beyond the energy sector itself. In this context, Khark is a point of contact, a place where local infrastructure connects with the global system. Decisions taken at the state level translate into consequences felt across the world, and that is precisely why the island is not merely an element of regional geopolitics. It is part of the global economic architecture. It shows how deeply the modern world depends on the stability of specific points whose significance extends far beyond their physical limits. A single disruption can spread outward like a wave across the entire globe, reaching even places where nobody recognizes the source of what has happened. Modern conflicts increasingly begin without official declarations. They also increasingly avoid taking the form of open confrontation at the outset. Instead, they develop in an ambiguous space, dispersed, hard to grasp, and difficult to define with precision. These actions are not called war. Yet their effects can be comparable to those of classical military operations. And it is precisely in that space that Khark is situated, an island which, formally speaking, remains an export terminal, but in reality functions as one of the quiet fronts of global rivalry. This is not a front visible in everyday media coverage. It is not accompanied by images of armored columns. There are no massive bombardments watched live by the whole world. Instead, there are isolated incidents, unclear events, sudden failures, unconfirmed reports. Together, they create an atmosphere of tension that remains below the threshold of open conflict, yet is constantly present and very real. One of the most important elements of this shadow war is the maritime domain. That is where oil transport takes place. That is where Khark connects to the outside world. That is where tankers leave the island and enter the global trading system. At that moment, they become both part of infrastructure and potential targets of destabilizing action. In recent years, incidents involving tankers have become increasingly frequent. Some have suffered damage under unclear circumstances. Others have been detained. Still others have been forced to alter course. All of this has created an atmosphere of uncertainty and raised the operational risk of the system as a whole. Every such episode affects the decisions of ship owners, insurers, and buyers. Even if the scale of a single incident is limited, its effects spread further through prices, delays, and altered calculations of risk. An increase in the number of incidents in the Persian Gulf region leads to higher insurance costs for shipping and therefore to higher costs across the entire supply chain. That reveals something important. Even limited actions can have a real impact on the functioning of the market. There is no need to sink dozens of ships. Sometimes it is enough to create an atmosphere of permanent uncertainty. Fear of disruption can be almost as effective as disruption itself. Alongside actions at sea, another dimension of the conflict has been expanding. It is less visible, but no less important. That dimension is cyberspace. Infrastructure such as Khark becomes a target there through attacks on control systems, monitoring systems, and management systems. Disrupting the functioning of the terminal does not necessarily require a physical strike. It can be achieved by interfering with its digital foundations, with systems that remain invisible from the outside, yet upon which almost the entire rhythm of operations depends. In a world where industrial systems are becoming ever more automated and interconnected, a cyber attack can lead to the suspension of operations, to errors in flow management, and even to damage to infrastructure. At that point, the boundary between technical action and military action begins to blur. Khark becomes one of those places where that boundary is especially thin. It is very easy to imagine a situation in which nobody officially declares war, and yet the terminal stops functioning. Tankers wait, storage tanks fill up, markets react, and the effect is almost the same as after a conventional strike. At the same time, acts of sabotage also appear in this landscape. They are not always confirmed, they cannot always be clearly attributed, but they fit into a broader pattern. Energy infrastructure becomes the target of operations designed to destabilize the adversary without provoking full-scale war. That makes such actions especially difficult to assess and even harder to answer. Because how does one respond to something that formally does not exist, to an event that everyone suspects, but which no one can or wants to name directly? It is not only states that operate in this space. Intermediary actors are present as well. Operational groups, structures functioning at the edge of official institutions. That complicates the situation further. Responsibility for specific incidents becomes blurred. Responses must take into account the risk of escalation, and they must do so under conditions of uncertainty. It is not always clear who really struck, who merely created an illusion, who acted independently, and who functioned as an instrument of a larger player. Khark, as one of the most important oil export points in the world, stands at the center of this concealed rivalry. Its significance means that any disruption has the potential to generate effects extending far beyond the region. That makes it an attractive target for actions intended to be effective, yet difficult to attribute with certainty. These are precisely the kinds of targets most valued today. They make it possible to inflict a blow without fully stepping into open war. Modern conflicts increasingly focus on critical infrastructure. That is the foundation upon which states function. Disrupting it can produce effects comparable to classical military operations, while at the same time reducing the risk of overt confrontation. That is why a terminal, a port, a transmission network, or a control system ceases to be merely a technical support structure of the state. It becomes its soft underbelly, a point that can be struck more cheaply, more discreetly, and at times more effectively. As a result, Khark operates under permanent pressure. Its operators must take into account not only technical and logistical issues, they must also consider threats arising from actions that are not always visible, but are always possible. That means the island functions under continuous tension. Every operational decision now has a security dimension. Every element of the system must be treated as a potential point of vulnerability. Every failure can be suspected of being something more than mere accident. And that is exactly why the Shadow War is not an addition to the story of Khark. It is an integral part of it. In a world where infrastructure becomes a battlefield, the island is no longer only a place where oil is loaded. It is one of those points at which modern geopolitics is played out. Quiet, dispersed, difficult to grasp, yet exerting a real influence on the shape of the global system. There are places that cannot be destroyed, even though everyone knows they can, and it is precisely in that paradoxical space that Khark operates. An island that is at once one of Iran's most important assets and one of the most obvious pressure points for its adversaries. This means that its existence is embedded in a logic of balance, though not a balance grounded in stability. It is rather a balance grounded in awareness of consequences too great to be ignored. Within that logic, Khark ceases to be merely an export terminal. It begins to function as a hostage of the international system, a point whose violation would not simply mean a blow against Iran, it would also mean a blow against the global energy market. Every decision relating to this island therefore carries weight far greater than its local context. Even if someone looks at it only as an element of Iranian infrastructure, they very quickly have to recognize that its fate does not end at the border of one state. For the United States, Khark is an obvious element of strategic calculation. It is a place that, in theory, could be used as an instrument of pressure. A strike against Iran's primary oil export point would mean an immediate reduction in its revenues and therefore a weakening of the state's ability to finance its own activities, both internal and external. From a military perspective, that logic is almost intuitive. If you want to weaken an adversary, you strike the place from which it draws its strength. At the same time, the same logic works in the opposite direction. A potential strike on Khark would carry the risk of an Iranian response, a response that could include disruption of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. A substantial portion of global oil trade passes through that strait. That would lead to rising prices, destabilized markets, and political pressure on states dependent on imported energy. In other words, a blow delivered to Iran would very quickly become a blow delivered to others as well. In that sense, the island stands at the center of an arrangement resembling deterrence equilibrium. Each side possesses the ability to inflict damage, but each must simultaneously consider the consequences of using that ability. This makes Khark part of a strategy in which the existence of the option matters more than action itself. The mere awareness that one could act is often enough to ensure that one does not act at all. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates observe this situation with a mixture of distance and anxiety. They are rivals of Iran, but they also function within the same energy system. Destabilization of one of its key elements can also affect their own infrastructure, their own revenues, and their own market position. That leads to an approach more cautious than one might assume. Rivalry does not always mean wanting to burn down the entire house, especially if one lives next door. The European Union and Asian states, as major energy importers, view Khark above all as an element of systemic risk. Its destabilization would mean higher prices, supply problems, inflationary pressure, and social tension. That is why, in their calculations, the island does not appear primarily as a target. It appears rather as a point whose stability must be maintained. Even if relations with Iran remain politically difficult, economic interest often forces a more pragmatic view than the language of diplomatic declarations would suggest. Sudden disruptions in energy supply have the potential to produce global economic effects. That is why infrastructure such as Khark is sometimes treated as an element of systemic stability, even when it is located in a state subject to sanctions or political tension. The world may not trust Tehran. It may seek to constrain it, but at the same time, it does not want one of the key valves of the market suddenly torn out of the mechanism. Russia and China approach this situation in a more complex way. On the one hand, they can benefit from rising energy prices. On the other, they must take into account the risk of destabilizing a market that is itself crucial to them. That leads to an approach based on balancing between economic interest and system stability, between the desire to exploit crisis and the fear that crisis may slip beyond control. As a result, Khark stands at the center of a structure in which every player has reason to analyze it, to consider its significance, and to incorporate it into strategy. Yet at the same time, very few have any real interest in destroying it. An unusual situation emerges. The island is both threatened and protected by the logic of the system itself. Not because everyone wants to save it, but because too many fear the consequences of losing it. That paradox is what defines its contemporary role. Khark is not safe in any absolute sense. It functions rather within a space of relative security, deriving not from the absence of threats, but from their excess. Every potential move must be carefully considered. Any strike could unleash effects that would no longer be easy to contain. In that sense, the island becomes a symbol of modern geopolitics. Power no longer lies solely in the capacity to act. Increasingly, it also lies in the capacity to refrain from acting. Infrastructure is not just an economic tool. It becomes a strategic element. It may stabilize the system, but if violated, it may also contribute to its rapid destabilization, and that is precisely why Khark functions today as a hostage of equilibrium, a point whose importance means that its fate does not depend on one state alone. It depends on the entire balance of forces, a balance not always visible but decisive in determining whether the world remains in a condition of tense stability or moves into a phase of open crisis. There comes a moment when infrastructure begins to behave differently, not because it has been formally attacked, but because all participants in the system begin to sense that something is approaching. And it is precisely in such a phase that Khark finds itself during periods of mounting tension. The island does not slow down. It accelerates. Instead of reducing operations, it intensifies them, as if trying to outrun events that have not yet begun, but are already shaping the decisions taken around it. In such moments, the pace of exports begins to rise. Storage tanks empty faster than usual. Loading schedules grow tighter. The state seeks to maximize the flow of crude before any possible disruption. That means every barrel moved out of the system ahead of time is treated as a form of future insurance, a way to minimize losses if operations are suddenly interrupted. Tankers begin to line up, not always in ways visible in official data, but very clearly felt in the rhythm of the terminal's work. Loading operations proceed almost without pause. Every available slot is used. In periods of uncertainty, time becomes a resource almost as important as the oil itself. At the same time, the behavior of market participants begins to change. Ship owners, traders, buyers, all start adjusting strategy. They increase inventories, they accelerate deliveries, they search for alternative sources. That leads to increased activity across the entire system, not only on the island itself. An effect of acceleration emerges, felt not locally but globally. In such periods, Iran often increases oil exports. It seeks to maximize revenues before potential restrictions take effect. That shows something highly significant. Infrastructure such as Khark is not used only for stable, routine activity. It is also an instrument for managing risk, especially under conditions of uncertainty. In parallel, military presence around the island grows, not always in spectacular fashion. Instead of open mobilization, there is a subtler increase in activity. More frequent patrols, greater alertness in defensive systems, more intensive monitoring. This creates an atmosphere of readiness, an atmosphere in which every element of the system functions under a heightened level of attention. That combination is decisive here. Operational acceleration and increased vigilance. Together they create a condition that can be described as the calm before the storm. The system functions at full speed, while at the same time preparing for the possibility of abrupt interruption. That means every day of the island's functioning acquires a double meaning. It is part of normal activity, and at the same time, it may be the last day before conditions change. During such periods, less obvious signals also begin to appear. To outside observers, they may remain unnoticed, but to participants in the system, they are legible. Changes in tanker routes, a greater number of ship-to-ship transfers at sea, modifications in delivery schedules. All of these together create the image of a system preparing for disruption. At the same time, oil importing states begin to take protective measures. They increase strategic reserves. They diversify supply. That shows that tension around Khark is not perceived as a local problem. It is treated as a potential threat to the stability of the global energy market.